Every choice brings about a death, and the death is of all the other choices that we could have had and the freedom that we had before we made the choice. But once we've made the choice and taken responsibility for that choice, then we have new freedoms. A person who has children has freedom to befriend their children, bring them up. Those choices are not available to the person who doesn't make that choice.
What was it that first drew you to existential questions?
If we think of the existential questions as who am I and what's the meaning of life and what's the meaning of my life and so on, I've always been curious about that. I bought a book on how to do yoga, teach yourself yoga, when I was 12 years old. So, and in there was all the wisdom and knowledge of how to be a human being that one could want, although somewhat esoteric at that age. But, I've always been interested in, what it means to be me. And that journey has gone through being interested in Buddhism, being interested in Daoism particularly, which I find to be a very existential philosophy, and then maybe doing a transpersonal course in CCPE. 10 years ago, I was asked by CCPE to do the existential lectures on the third year diploma. I got an email 3 weeks beforehand saying, do you want to do this? And I was in Nice at the time. And I thought, how can I possibly know enough to do 2 lectures about existentialism in 3 weeks? We were in a flat in a house in Nice. And as we were leaving, this is true, I honestly haven't made this up, and I have a photograph to prove it. There was a plaque on the door, a blue plaque, which said that Friedrich Nietzsche had stayed here when he came to Nice in 1880 something, or 1870 something, whatever it was. So I thought, well, that must be a sign. The universe, well, not a very existential thought, but the universe has given me a sign that I need to do this. So I did. And of course, at the beginning, it was, clunky, too much knowledge and not enough dialogue. But over the years, I've come to be more familiar with the subject, to see that the philosophy itself is important, but it isn't so important. What's important is how it's applied to existential therapy. At the beginning, I was very much drawn to Yalom, and still am, Irvin Yalom, but I've moved on from there. And I think that while there's lots there that's important, some of the British school of existential psychotherapy have got a huge amount of interesting things to say about how to be an existential therapist.
How could you define existential therapy?
Existential therapy is an exploration. It's an exploration of what it means to be human, what it means to be a human being in a world that is random, that is meaningless. Well, not a world, a universe that is meaningless. The world can be full of meaning, but we make the meaning. We're invited to believe that there's a sort of universal theme to all our lives, and where in fact there isn't. There's only our theme to our lives with other people. So while it's not a sort of solipsistic way of thinking about it's just us in the universe, it isn't. It's us with others, with the world. But each journey is individual. We have to make the story of our own lives. And I think that's what existentialism encourages us to do.
And it's maybe not to say that there isn't meaning out there, but the meaning that's created out there will be created by another being.
That may be the case, but it starts from the perspective, a humanistic perspective, really, that actually it's us. And actually that's not an inconsiderable thing, because we are human beings in the world who can reflect on ourselves. That makes us available to something. Now, according to Heidegger, that something was being itself, the great flow of being. And our work in this is to clear that space so we can experience being coming through us. Now, he would say, I think, I mean, I don't want to speak for any of these philosophers, but from what I understand, he would say it's got nothing to do with any universal being or universal consciousness. It is this thing that we don't pay enough attention to, which is being itself. And what is it? And that's where existentialism starts. What is being? I think that Heidegger had nothing to do with any kind of religious or spiritual perspective on what he was doing, because I think he wanted to present a philosophical position on it. But there's no doubt that he knew about Eastern philosophy and was influenced by it. And as well as Western spiritual traditions, because he went to a seminary before he decided to become a philosopher. So it was there, and of course, I suppose what he would say is that he was trying to find a secular position on the great questions, which all religions address too.
So, what does it mean to say that something has meaning for someone?
To go back to who we are as human beings, I don't know what he is exactly, but a neuroscientist called Jack Panksepp. He said that there are 7 primary emotional networks within a human being, and the most important one is seeking. Animals, not just humans, but animals are primed to seek food, seek shelter, seek safety, seek companionship and socialness, if that's the nature of that animal, and so on. And so that's fundamental to us. So we seek meaning. We see patterns in things, and we seek to know what those patterns mean. So we can only answer that question on an individual level from an existential perspective, that something has meaning because it has meaning and value to us, that it's something that resonates with us, it's something that's important to us. So that could be family, it could be our work, it could be being service to others, it could be art, whatever it might be, or it could be collecting butterflies or whatever, these things can have meaning for us. It's for us to decide and to find that meaning. And it's our responsibility to do that.
What makes you say that?
Well, because we are humans who seek meaning. So if we want to have a meaningful life, that's what we have to do. But to do that, we have to find out who we are, and finding out who we are involves making choices and taking responsibility for those choices. So I think when we go back into meaninglessness, that feeling of meaninglessness, it often comes from the fact that we've lost that will to actually seek out things that have meaning for us.
What are the 4 givens that Irvin Yalom describes?
One of the most important ones is death. We're all going to die. And we're all aware of this. Like no other animal, as far as we know, we're all aware that we are going to die. And yet we have a wish to continue. I mean, this is the essential conflict, the dilemma that we have. We want to live forever, and we're not going to. So we devise various ways of thinking that we might live forever, like there's an afterlife. We may say outside the existential sphere that is a possibility. We might come back as something else, or there's a heaven somewhere that we go to, or a hell, which is also an afterlife. And that we go there. But the existentialist says, no, that actually this is what we have, and it's finiteness that gives it meaning. Death gives life its poignancy, its urgency, its meaning. Then there's freedom. So, and this is an important one too, because this is what defines us as being human, that we have the freedom to choose. And when we've chosen, we have the responsibility for those choices. So to not accept the responsibility for those choices is to act in bad faith. We don't live in isolation. We live in the world, and everything that we do has an impact on the world. So we have to take responsibility for that impact. And part of this, this is that this being in the world, as Heidegger describes it, is that we care for others. That we have to take care of others. That's part of our responsibility in the world, and so freedom comes with choice, comes with responsibility, comes with the will to act. We have to act on our choices, and so on. So it's all part of it.
I have a good friend who often talks about the trade-off between freedom and intimacy. And that's to say, if you want to do something like get married and you want to experience the depth of the intimacy in that, you have to give up the freedom. Similarly, if you want to have children and you want to experience the intimacy that comes with that, you have to give up an even greater amount of freedom, maybe.
Yes, that's right, you do. But freedom to choose implies making a choice. Every choice brings about a death, and the death is of all the other choices that we could have had and made, and the freedom that we had before we made the choice. But once we've made the choice and taken responsibility for that choice, then we have new freedoms. You know, a person who has children has freedom to befriend their children, bring them up, and so on. So those choices are not available to the person who doesn't make that choice. So each giving up of a freedom brings a new freedom.
The relinquishing of the freedom opens new possibilities, even though they don't know what they are yet.
Even though they don't know what they are yet, yes. And that's a part of the nature of being human as well, is that we're always changing. Although we think we're not, we are. Each moment is new. And it's our responsibility to embrace that, as well as to sometimes not embrace it and sit and watch television, if that's what we want to do.
So how about the isolation?
Yes. Well, I mean, that idea is that, you know, at the deepest level, we're alone. We're born alone, we die alone, and yet we seek others. We seek contact with others. And how do we, this fact of existence, how does that square with our need to be with others and the fact that we are with others as well? And I mean, it's one of the givens that I have that's problematic, in the sense that we're never alone. We're always in relation to others, and the relational is also a strong part of existential therapy. You know, even though the relational concepts don't come from existentialism, they are part of the practice of the therapy, that we're all beings in relation to others as a fundamental. So, but nonetheless, I think that what it means is that although we are part of the human race, we still have to forge our own path, make our own path in the world, find our own meanings, find our own relationships, and so on. So that's the dilemma. How do we move out of our isolation, but stay on a path that's individually ours?
And how is it that grappling with those questions which don't really have an ultimate answer can also bring us answers, kind of paradoxically?
The dialogue with others, or with nature, or with the animal world, or whatever it might be, through that there are always questions, and we find out of that engagement with the world, we find new things emerging, new ideas, new possibilities. So these are the answers, but the answers are just in a way for this moment. You know, that then we engage with them, and then new dilemmas, new concerns, new possibilities emerge. So it's a constant engagement with life, and in doing that, we our own human identity emerges over the course of a lifetime. I think Heidegger says that something like, we can only really know what our life means at the end of our life, because it's always in a state of becoming. We're always in a state of continual or continuous selfing or selving, becoming a new self in each moment. When people come into therapy, they come in because they've become ossified. Their ideas have become, I think in existentialism they call them sedimented. Layers of sedimentation just build up, so a person can't move because they can only think in a certain way about themselves. And the role of the dialogue in existentialism is to loosen that sedimentation through phenomenological inquiry, so that the person can begin to see that the way they see the world isn't the only way of seeing the world, that there are other possibilities.
So what does phenomenological inquiry mean?
Phenomenology is a philosophy, and it's very complex and it's got lots of applications, but essentially it's the study of our subjective experience of the world. So in psychotherapy, it's about giving our full attention to our subjective experience of the world that we live in, and through this, we have to embrace uncertainty. That actually the world isn't the way we think it is, and that it may be something completely different. And there is a French philosopher, or was, I think he died recently too, called Bruno Latour, who said that we think we live in a world of certainty, but actually we live in little islands of certainty in a vast ocean of uncertainty, and we stick to those little islands. But sometime in a life, many people understand that those little islands of certainty aren't enough, and that the real richness of life lies in embracing the uncertainty. And I think that's the real excitement in existential therapy.
When you say examining our subjective experience, are you talking about thinking about the question, what is happening right now? And maybe thinking about that on a level that goes beyond the intellect?
Absolutely, absolutely. And in fact, I'm glad you brought that up, actually, because it's really important that in phenomenological inquiry that you put aside any thinking about it, any processing, any understanding, and stay with the pre-reflective subjective experience. One of the things that they say in phenomenology is that it's describe, describe, describe. It's all about description. So you ask the client about their experience. So let's say their experience is about their life growing up. You ask them about their experience, and then you ask them again and again and again. And tell me about that. And what was that like? And tell me about that. What you will notice is that each time you ask, the story changes. Something new comes in, a different perspective comes in. And in this process, the client begins to see other aspects of they've told themselves a story. This is what my life has been like, and this is why I am like I am. And of course, lots of therapies play to that. That the reason I'm like this today is a series of cause and effects that have led to this. Existential therapy says, forget cause and effect. That we don't know what causes how I am today, and I've just told myself a story about this. Now, of course, that doesn't mean to say that things in the past haven't influenced what we are at the moment, but that it's not cause and effect. And I think that perhaps existential therapy might say that the future is more important than the past. That the reasons we do things are more influenced by the future than they are about something that happened 40 years ago. I mean, we're even now going back to 40 years ago, 80 years ago, to our grandparents. So it's never ending. That happened, so that's why I am like this. It's not to say that there isn't truth in that, but existential therapy says actually what's more immediate and richer is what's happening, the present that's happening. All of that is here in the present. Let's work with that, and we'll find out more.
The stories we tell ourselves about what's happened to us define our present experience completely. And so in therapy, you can be given the space to tell yourself a new story, which isn't to say that the previous one was untrue, but it's just shining new light on how you see yourself.
I think that's right, and it's widening it. It's kind of making it so that your past is much richer, and your present therefore becomes much richer. You're not the same person that you were with this rather limited story.
The activity of turning your attention to what is happening right now beyond what might be happening later today, or how you're feeling, or what you've been thinking about, just the activity of turning your attention and training it on the experience itself without any thought. That seems like something that people don't do in our culture at all, really.
We're very conditioned, and very conditioned as therapists, to think about how what does this mean? Sort of secondary thinking, not the primary pre-reflective experience, which we naturally do. But we've lost that capacity to naturally do it. We're always being asked, what does that mean? How do we understand this? How can we explain this? And, and I notice this as a therapist, that I'm always trying to make a pattern out of something. I'm always trying to think, well, what might this mean? How does that connect to that? Well, you know what they call in existential therapy bracketing, or epoche bracketing, where you put aside all of that, all that you know. It's just there. You're not forgetting it, but my experience, my understanding isn't important. What's important is the client's subjective experience of their world, and my experience of them as I'm listening to that. It's a relationship. It's never just them. It's always us. And as that person comes into that sense of themselves, that changes me too as the therapist.
What does it mean to live authentically?
It's about embracing uncertainty. Okay, it's about not knowing. One of the great gifts of existential therapy is that we don't know. We have no idea what's going on for the client, only what they tell us. Okay, we don't have to formulate any diagnosis, and we don't have to know. We embrace the uncertainty of this encounter rather than reaching for an explanation or a conclusion. What we're doing is we're reaching for the safety of the island of safety, of certainty. Or if we don't know now, well, we soon will. Just get enough information, or let me just remember that piece of theory that I learnt the other day, or I learnt it when I was training, and I'll be all right. But that's not being authentic, okay, in terms of the therapy. What's being authentic is embracing uncertainty as it happens, and staying with that and not reaching for a conclusion. Negative capability, Keats's negative capability. Positive capability is the idea that, well, I've got a problem here, let me find the answer. Negative capability is sitting in the unknown and seeing what emerges from that dynamic. From Heidegger's perspective, inauthenticity is being fully in the world that you were born into, with all its rules and expectations and cultural patterns. We don't question that. This is what it is. But existential therapy encourages to move out of that into the real reality, which is the other reality, which is that life, the universe, and everything is in constant flux. Every moment is new. Every moment brings a new possibility of being, for me, for the other person, and so on. And so that's being authentic, to be open to that.
How difficult can it be for people to kind of arrive into that way of thinking when they've been, spent a lifetime believing the opposite?
Well, I think it's very difficult. I mean, it must be very difficult, but I don't think it's impossible. And of course, some people don't want to. It's too unsafe. But actually, if you can embrace it and embrace a more uncertain way of being in the world, then
It seems to me that you're inviting people to kind of go against the idea that they are in control to some extent. If you think about the ego as being built to self-sustain itself, and the mind is built to know what's going on, you're inviting people to kind of go beyond those two things. And those are often the core of people's identity. So, I can just imagine it taking a while to bring people into the right kind of headspace to do the work sometimes.
Well, as we know, it takes a crisis to bring people into therapy. Something happens, a relationship breaks down, there's a death, losing a job, or just finding that life is meaningless. That crisis brings people into a place where they can question, or they're available to questioning what's happening in their lives and why they think like that. And that's when the desedimentation, I don't know if there is a word for that, desedimentation begins, that breaking down of these rigid structures to a more fluid way of being in the world.
It seems like an invitation to examine the beliefs that you hold about the world that aren't actually true or useful, and letting go of those. And what you're left with is the same thing that you started with, which is this present experience, but without the shackle of the unhelpful story.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, children have much more in touch with their own subjective experience than adults are.
Well, as you grow and you learn more about the world, this idea about who you are gets reinforced over and over and over again. You're moving in the opposite direction as you grow up in a way. And then hopefully at a certain point in your life, you recognize that and they're able to then start to deconstruct what's happened and try and arrive in a more useful way of being that's not constraining your present experience and your ability to find happiness in the world.
I think that's right, and maybe useful is one way of putting it, but a more rewarding, just more fulfilling way of being in the world. But of course, that comes with uncertainty and difficult moments. It's not unadulterated joy, but it's alive. I think that's the important thing, that it's alive, and it's not all the time. We can't live in this. In the flow of existence all the time. We have to have our moments in front of the television.
I wonder if we could move on to talk about this idea of therapeutic presence and what that means to you.
Well, what we're all practicing as part of this embracing uncertainty is presence. We're practicing how to be present to the world in this moment. And so presence that's therapeutic for another person is it's a combination of things. It's a combination of attention, being attentive, and attuning to the other person. So again, it's that idea of getting ourselves out of the way so that we can be more fully with the other person. That I thou way of being with another, two subjects with another. Now, of course, in therapy, there are lots of people who come into therapy who can't stand too much presence from another person because it's traumatic, so we have to be very careful in how we attend to another person, but we give as much as the person is able to bear and invite them in, and gradually, as they maybe hopefully build trust, they'll be able to be more present with us.
In what way might being really present with someone in a therapeutic context be difficult for them?
I don't want to use labels here, of course, but somebody who has schizoid tendencies, who's quite avoidant, might find somebody who's kind of just very attentive and looking at them, not staring at them, but looking at them with that therapeutic gaze. They might find that very, very uncomfortable, to just sitting with somebody where they are the sole focus of the attention of another person. You're not talking about something over there, you're talking about them. That can be very uncomfortable for people who are quite avoidant.
The thing that's coming to my mind is thinking about people that I've met who practice things like mindfulness or are in a very high state of presence with someone. And in that, when you meet them, there is maybe an inhumanness about that in a way, And so it's about that balance of bracing the uncertainty of the present moment and staying with that, and also staying very human in that as well. So you can see how it might go too far.
That's absolutely right. It can go too far. It can be too much. The person is no longer human. They're almost a celestial presence or something like that. I can't quite remember the terminology that Nietzsche uses, but he talked about that most people, when they're born into the world, he described them as camels. They just do their jobs. They go to work. They do their work. They come home. They feed their family, whatever it might be. He said that you should become lions, go out into the world and really find out who you are, essentially. And then this is the bit I can't remember now. Then you come home, you come back, and you go back to being an ordinary person. It's that's the important bit. Becoming an ordinary person. You haven't forgotten what you were. It's still there. It's still part of who you are, but it's not disturbing everybody around you. Jung said once that after he'd done a seminar with lots of psychologists or whatever they were, psychiatrists, they said to him, well, we've done all this stuff. It's amazing. What do we do now? And he said, you need to go home and become decently unconscious. And it's that kind of that idea that, we have to fit back into the world that we come from, not to give ourselves away, but just to hold in all that we've learned. We're all trying to get along in this life. Just because I happen to know a little bit more about how the human consciousness works, a little bit more, doesn't mean I have the right to tell other people what to do and challenge them all the time. So, we have to be subtle about things.
So how is it that you think that being with clients and sitting with them in the uncertainty of them wrestling with these questions can help bring about real change for someone?
Partly because it's not thinking about, it's being in the moment with them. And it brings us to that I-thou moment, I-thou moment or I-thou process where we are fully present with another human being. And that's the place of possibilities. That's the place when new things can happen. That's the place when a transformation happens. If we can become fully present, everything will change. And it's a permanent change. It's not about me saying, right, I'm going to go out there and do it differently now. And then, of course, a week later, I'm still doing the same thing. It's about a fundamental transformation takes place. This comes from a book called The Healing Relationship in Gestalt Therapy. And Gestalt therapy is a form of existential therapy, works in the here and now. And it's by a guy called Richard Heisner and Lynn Jacobs. The I-thou moment is a moment in which we are totally absorbed with another, which paradoxically puts us profoundly in contact with our humanity, with the knowledge of being. And in this moment, the meaning of human existence is revealed. Okay, now you have to have that moment. I can't tell you what that is. You'll find out for yourself. But if you ever have those moments, and they may be quite rare, that's when meaning is there. And that's the transformative moment.
To me, that speaks to the idea of the integration of being and the other type of self, maybe the greater self and the relative self. You could describe them as, maybe the recognition that you are in relationship with everything else. And then, as you described earlier, there's that process of going back into the world with that knowledge and the challenge of integration, reintegration.
That's right. That's very well put. The challenge of integration. And of course, the knowledge that we had in that moment has to also transform. It never ends. That's the problem with this journey, is once you begin the journey, it never ends.
But still worthwhile.
Always worthwhile, yeah. That's what you get you get the world when you do this work.
What was it that Daoism said about this kind of thing?
Well, I think that Daoism, again, that's another, it's hard to talk about, that's what it says in the first verse of the Tao. The Tao that can be named is not the true Tao. And yet it's about being. It's about the flow of being. I don't know, they call it chi or the Tao. They call it the Tao, the way that it flows. And we have to, in order to live fully, we have to flow with it and not fight it. So I think that that's what we're trying to do is that two people in a room. So if you've got the therapist and the client, two people in a room, what your three of you are paying attention to is what's going on for me as a therapist, what's going on for the other person as the client, and what's happening between us. That flow, what's coming into being through our contact. And that's always what we're trying to find. What's coming into being through our time together.
Are there any questions in particular that you feel that you've wrestled with over the course of your life?
Lots. But of course. I mean, and still do, because that's the nature of it, and I suppose the question of, for example, when I was sort of doing a little bit of preparation for this, I kind of thought I don't know enough, because you can't know enough. And then, of course, that brings the idea is that actually what I know, I mean, in the way, the nature of this particular dialogue is you asking me, the person who doesn't know, and of course you do know a lot, asking me, the person who does know, and of course there's a lot that I don't know, what all this means. But of course, that's not what existentialism is. It's really about the dialogue and what we discover through the dialogue. And that's what we're doing in therapy and in life. What do we discover through the dialogue that we have with life?
Did you have a particular experience with the discovery of being, as we've discussed before?
The shift that I've made is a quite core belief in existentialism is that there is no inner man. There's no inner me. There's only me in relation to the world. Even my feelings are not in me. They're in the world that I live in, and they're all around me. And that's why phenomenology asks questions not really about what's going on in you, although that's part of it, but what's going on in your world, because you are your world. And of course, we're all in that world, and we're all flowing along with being. I was in Poland at the seaside resort that I'd just gone to on a boat for the day, sitting on the pier, and I was listening to this saxophonist. As I was listening to that, all these people were coming off the boat, and the music was quite loud, so I wasn't distracted by anything, and I saw the people just flowing all as one down the pier towards me. It was all as if very phenomenological. They were all coming into being in this moment. They were appearing in the world for me in this moment, flowing together. Now, clearly, for themselves, they were just walking down the pier. But for me, I saw that actually that's not the case, that they were actually flowing. Whether that's just a delusion, I don't know. But it seems to me to be that reality under the surface, that we're all flowing in this great beingness, but we don't know it.
This is the thing that people are actually talking about when they say they enjoy things like running or climbing or whatever it is that puts them into that state of being in very direct contact with the present moment with no cognitive agenda. And in that moment, they experience their own absence. And they are just with what's happening, and they are what's happening. And that's a great relief. It's the relief of the burden of yourself in that moment. So then you get home and you think, oh, running's great. And you tell your friends to start running. But actually, it's not about the running. It's about the moment of you experiencing your own absence, which is at the same time a perfect presence.
That's absolutely right. It's a perfect presence. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I do, sometimes on an airplane, I'm listening to music, and I'm watching people. Maybe they're waiting to go to the loo, and they're chatting, and I can't hear them, all I can hear is the music, but I can see this flow between them. And it's quite remarkable. And that's right. I'm absent but fully present.
People often describe having those moments standing on top of a mountain. That's like kind of the ultimate cliche of that moment of being awestruck or in rapture. But the problem with that is it's conditional upon them being on top of the mountain, and they believe that they need to be in a special place to have that type of experience. And the invitation is to see that actually that is available at all times.
It's a very individual experience, but peak experiences of spirituality are more useful and happen more in groups of people who are doing something together. I mean, it could be singing or engage in some physical activity or something like that, or a religious ceremony or some. They experience a spirituality very like that, but it belongs to the group. It doesn't. It's not about them and their individual experience.
I'm thinking about how it is to go to a music festival for the first time when you're younger. And that itself feels like a really special and unique type of connection that you have with the place and the people who are there. And then you come away from it and you think, God, I've got to go back there again next year to refine that.
That's the problem, isn't it? You have to find it. But actually, it's not about as going on the mountain. It's not about going back there and finding it again. It's not there.
That is the confusion, is you think that experience is the source of that feeling. So you need to create, certain things need to happen, like you need to, be in relationship, or you need to take drugs, or you need to do X, Y, and Z in order to find that feeling again. And especially when you're young, your life almost is about seeking out those peak experiences.
Yeah, I think that's right. But it's important to do those kinds of things because we are seeking animals. We're seeking beings, so we need to seek out these things and have the experience that we can then, at least we know it. We know what it is and we can recognize it when we later on in life learn to integrate it into our everyday life. But I suppose, and I don't know what I'm talking about when I say this, but I suppose that dopamine hit that we get from scrolling through Instagram or whatever is a kind of an ersatz form of that. It's a false form of that peak experience that leaves us very unsatisfied. The experience that you have at the music festival isn't unsatisfying. It is a genuine experience. It's just that you can't repeat it in the same way the next year.
How do you see the freedom versus responsibility question playing out in modern masculinity, and what are the consequences of avoiding responsibility?
Freedom versus responsibility. Freedom isn't versus responsibility in my mind. Freedom and responsibility go together. And I think that that's where it plays out in modern masculinity. They're seen as contradictory. They're seen as conflicting with each other. So I have the freedom to do what I want, but I won't take the consequences, the responsibility for the consequences of my action. And that leads to, all kinds of toxicity, but toxic masculinity. And you can see it playing out. I mean, I don't know so much about it, but Andrew Tate, for example, saying you're free to do what you want. You're men. That's what men do. Claim your birthright without actually, and throughout history, young men have been taught through sort of ritual that actually they have power, but they also have responsibilities that go with that power. They have the freedom to choose, but they have to choose with regard to others.
What do you think of the challenges that seem to come up later in life for people?
We can get very comfortable, think that we know it all. There's no fool like an old fool, and we have to be aware of that. How do we stay relevant? How do we stay part of the human community, and how do we wisely bring our wisdom to the party, because it's needed for a generation of people now, the boomers coming towards the end of their lives. They didn't go through those rituals. The rituals for many of them were drink and drugs and too much freedom, maybe, and so what wisdom have we gained from that, and how can we bring that wisdom to the world? I think that's the existential challenge. And of course, facing up to death. It's a big thing, dying. You get to a certain age and you realize it's, you're not going to live forever. We always know we're not going to live forever, but until you've passed that point, which is kind of in your mid-50s, where you suddenly realize that you're looking down the barrel of a gun and it's only a matter of time that actually that you begin to see that this will end. And that's a big thing. There's an understanding too that actually it's okay. The moment might not be okay. I don't know. But the actual fact of it is, we have to leave something behind. We have to leave a life behind.
How do you think that recognition has shaped how you live now?
Well, I still work. I'm working. I'm still learning. I'm still studying things. I'm still putting myself out there. That's how I keep going.
What's one existential question you think everyone should ask themselves?
A question that we should ask is, what does it mean to be? It's a huge thing, being. Heidegger said, why don't people pay more attention to what being really is? He called it the great wonder, this notion of being. Not a notion, it's not even something, and he said, why don't we pay it more attention? So what does it mean to be? And so when we ask that question and answer that question for ourselves, that's what our lives will be. And so when you get to 60 and 70 and 80 and 90 even, that is still the question. And how we answer it is how we will live our lives. It's the answering of it that's the important thing. It's the process of answering that gives us meaning, I think.